College football playoff. It was a political stance that I think is a precedent for the future.
Yeah, I learned that they're more interested in the four best teams than they are about pleasing everybody else. Two teams from one conference now in the college football playoff for the first time since its invention.
And I learned that Clemson, guys, is by far, in my opinion, the best team out there, the most complete team. Looking forward to seeing them go toe-to-toe with Roll Tide as we get closer to those playoffs in January. College Football Live rolls on right now.
Let's see who number one is. The number one team in the country, the reigning national champion, Clemson Tide.
Man, it's exciting. You know, 25 years since I've been to the Sugar Bowl.
You know, they lost at Syracuse, but they didn't have Kelly Bryant 100%. He didn't play in the second half of the game. I think that's right that Clemson's number one.
And making the playoff for the second time, the Big 12 champion, Oklahoma Sooners. Let's see who the Sooners will play in the national semifinal. We assume it's going to be Georgia, and it is.
And to come out like we have, Big 12 champions in the playoff, getting a chance to play a great Georgia team in the Rose Bowl is a thrill for us.
And he's a phenomenal player that we'll probably get to see and have a lot of sleepless nights over the next 30 days or so.
Who should be in that fourth spot?
We lost Auburn at Auburn. It's a rivalry game for us, tough place to play. Georgia lost there by a whole bunch too, so a lot more than we did.
I think it should be Alabama. Alabama.
I just like to speak for our team, and that's we had 2 wins over top 4 teams.
Ohio State, better wins. Ohio State, we got to split.
Number 4 and going to the playoff to face Clemson will be the Alabama Crimson Tide.
The selection committee just favored Alabama's full body of work over that of Ohio State.
I really do believe that based on the total body of work, that our team really deserves the opportunity to be in.
We were in a tough loss, 2 losses, but I think that was the toughest one, and I was kind of hoping that we had those, good wins.
Yes, there's always criticism. This was the most controversial, but I think a lot of people will coalesce around this decision and agree that they did the right thing.
How many times did you guys hear body of work over the last 24/48 hours? We do now know those teams that are going to be vying for the College Football Playoff National Championship Trophy presented by Dr. Pepper. So let's get to you, Greg. Was Alabama the right choice for that number 4 spot? I have never heard so much debate headed into a decision as I did about that 4th spot this weekend.
They were the right choice by a process of elimination. That's what it really comes down to. This wasn't about what Alabama did. This was entirely about Ohio State. And Ohio State, over the course of a 12-game regular season, appeared to be a flawed team, an inconsistent team, where there's moments where they look fantastic, like the last 9 minutes of the game against Penn State and against Michigan State. But then there's also moments where you're like, what was that? Like a 31-point drubbing at the hands of Iowa and the performance against Oklahoma throughout the course of the game. I know so much is centered around Alabama, their lack of significant wins, but this has everything to do with the fact that Ohio State was flawed and inconsistent, and the committee does not want to reward a team that lost by 30+ to an average Iowa team.
I think that's what you said at the end. Penn State last year lost by 40 to Michigan. Ohio State this year lost by 30 to Iowa. And when you're starting to compare those losses now, we've seen last year Ohio State got in as a non-conference champion with 1 loss, with Penn State being the champion. And this year Ohio State is in that boat, but they have that albatross that was hanging around their neck. And listen, I know it's not supposed to matter, Greg, but when you talk about the inconsistencies that are 1,000% real with Ohio State, if you watch their linebacker core, they're not going to be a defense that's going to shut people out. They've been very inconsistent on that side of the ball. I watched basically the same Ohio State team who was really good a year ago get beat 31-0 by this Clemson team. This Clemson team is better on defense probably than it was a year ago, not as good on offense, but I think you safely can say that if you're putting Alabama versus them, you can trust Alabama and what they've done to this point in the season, the way they're competitive, the way they're coached, the way they're physical. I just think the committee trusted them more to be a better game in the conference finals, which we've had some blowouts.
Yeah, and Dave, too, I think I look at Ohio State, too, and they put so much on the quarterback position. And, guys, J.T. Barrett's just average, and he's just up and down, too. I mean, this is a quarterback-centric offense. And he really is going to be probably the focal point. And a big reason why Ohio State's had any success this season has been because of J.T. Barrett and what he's capable of doing. I think that they go as he goes, and the committee's not willing to put in a team that relies so heavily on an inconsistent player. Alabama, as an entire unit, 22 starters, 11 on offense and 11 on defense. They just played more collectively. They played better as a team, and they were a more consistent group.
Yeah, it is an inexact science when you come down to splitting hairs like that. Absolutely. Right. But I also think, guys, that the fact that Alabama is going to be getting a lot of those players back may have affected the decision as well, knowing that as good as they've looked recently, they will look even better once you have some of those healthy players back in January. The question becomes matchups as well. How much do you think, David, the committee looks at the matchup and says, ooh, that's more intriguing than this?
I mean, I don't know anybody that wouldn't sign up for the trilogy. I mean, you think about the storylines in the last two seasons of what Clemson's been able to do against the mighty Crimson Tide that's kind of owned college football. So I think that's part of it. And now is when you start to see the matchups and how they matter. I mean, if you're going to be think about Alabama, they would prefer to play, you know, Jake Fromm and that type of style, and they would not prefer to play a mobile quarterback like Kelly Bryant. They can throw, they can give him fits, that can tempo the crud out of them. So, you know, now you see the matchups and how they're going to unfold. But tell you what, Greg, if you can find me a matchup where Baker Mayfield is going to get limited, I'd love to see that, because that dude's on another planet right now, whether people are getting his cell phone or not.
Yeah, good luck. Baker Mayfield's going to get you, like you said it yesterday, he's going to get you 30 just by rolling out of bed. I think that, and tying his shoes. So I look at the matchups, and I think that Clemson and Georgia was obvious. We knew that they were likely to be Oklahoma and Georgia was obvious. You knew that they were going to be the 2 and the 3. Is the 1 versus 4 matchups, and I'd like to think, I really would, I'd like to think that the committee really starts every single week with a blank sheet of paper. I just find it very hard to believe. They're human, Dave, and we all remember what it looked like in Phoenix in the Fiesta Bowl a year ago. When Ohio State and Clemson teed it up, it was one-sided. Clemson looks better in some spots than they did a year ago, and Ohio State looks the same. It's impossible to forget that matchup and how one-sided it got. So I do think it factored in when they're trying to really just sort through some of the issues and really boil down to the details. How can you forget that performance and the way it got one-sided a year ago?
Greg, David, do you think that the perception of the Big Ten and their performances in these types of bowl games recently impacted the decision?
I think it's, like Greg said, it's human nature, and not just Ohio State. The year before, Michigan State got hit upside the head too by Alabama and didn't even score a point. Neither team has scored a point. You still look at the Big Ten. You got 3 teams in the top 10, but obviously 0 in the college football playoff. And I think you could argue the merits of Wisconsin being a top 10 team, and their best win, I think, on the season is going to be Michigan. So it's a league that has struggled in the postseason for sure. And you look at their numbers versus their conference opponents, it's really good. And then you go and play defense elsewhere. Like, I mean, think about Michigan's defense, how ridiculous it was a year ago, and go play Florida State, that's a pretty good offense, and they're scoring in bunches. And so I think it is part of it. It's human nature. But, Greg, the one thing I'll say about, and Jen, the committee, the more we want info and the more we want them to talk and divulge information, the more they talk, the worse it is for them. Because then when they have to do, it's conference championships, it's a slight thin margin, it's this, it's that, the other, and then they have to go, okay, wait, you know, they're unequivocally better. The more they talk, the more they get themselves in trouble. If I was Kirby Hoka and Reese Davis asking me a question, I'd be like, we start with a blank sheet of paper every single week, and we're going to rank the best teams we think from what we've seen so far. So we start with a blank piece of paper, and we're going to rank them exactly how, because we're begging for information and transparency, and when he tries to give you some, we're going to be pissed and we're going to be upset anyways.
So you want some Bill Belichick-type answers from Kirby Hoka is what you're saying. We're on to the next rankings. We're on to the next rankings.
Yeah, just a way of self-preservation, right? The more you talk, the more you contradict yourself. Though I would say it is almost a universal human truth that the more you talk, the more you get yourself in trouble, but that might be too philosophical
I've never
for this
experienced
show.
that before.
Coming up, our guy Herm Edwards is headed to the desert at Arizona State, but he's going to be apparently a CEO, guys. What in the world does that mean? We'll dissect that after this. All right, guys, to another coaching move. After Saturday's fantastic game between UCF and Memphis, it was announced that Scott Frost would indeed be taking the position at Nebraska. But he says he wants to coach the team, the UCF team, in the bowl game, which, of course, now is the Peach Bowl versus Auburn. Greg, should coaches be able to stay and finish out their tenure with the team if they're in a bowl game?
No, I don't think they should. And I understand the emotional aspect of what Scott Frost is dealing with. But right now, you already know he's going. He's got one foot out the door, and it's not doing the players any good that are still there in that locker room knowing that he's going to be on his way out. Hey, cut ties, allow him to go to his next job, get started on what they're trying to build at Nebraska, and then have an interim situation where you'll play in a big bowl game at the Peach Bowl, and then move forward with your next head coach. I just don't think it's beneficial whatsoever. It just feels like you're lingering and kind of hanging on, and I don't think that's good for anybody in this type of circumstance.
I understand that, but I do think there is a time and a place for these things to happen. You know, Kirby Smart a couple years ago, national championship. I think he should have stayed on. So I think under those circumstances, when a bowl game is, you're fighting for it all and you're fighting to lift the trophy and be the champs, I am all on board for head coaches or for coordinators or coaches to stay on board and make sure that they don't go to the new school. But, you know, in this situation, when you're the head coach and you're leaving, it was, first of all, let me say this. It was really cool to see Scott Frost with his players and how emotional he was after the game. And you could tell those dudes mean something to him. Not every coach feels that way, by the way. That is unique. That is special. That is awesome. So I understand that, and I just think that's awesome that he wants to do it. But I'm with Greg in the end. This circumstance, probably not.
All right, guys, but here's what I would say to that. It doesn't have to be a universal truth that applies to every single situation. No, you go on a case-by-case here. Scott Frost with an opportunity to be undefeated, right, 13-0 with those guys. The other caveat is, of course, the relationship he has with the program. Clearly, there's no animosity here. It wasn't him slinking off in the middle of the night. I think that this might be a situation, and then you consider the early recruiting period, the early signing period, rather, which will be over, right, by the time that he would have to go back and coach the team. I think it makes sense for him to be able to finish what he started there. And the non-Power 5 versus the contender in Auburn, like that debate. I mean, there's a lot that means to UCF because they've felt very much disrespected all year long.
You know, but I'll say this too. If I'm a player on that UCF team, I have a little animosity. I'll be the first one to tell you, hey, by the way, I'm your quarterback, Mackenzie Milton. I just came to Orlando from Hawaii because you recruited me and you said you were going to coach me up. And now I know that Mackenzie Milton's gone out and said, hey, I support him, I'm rooting for him, I'm happy for him. Yeah, you say all the right things, but if I'm a player in that locker room, I'm a little bothered by the fact that my coach just left me for greener pastures. So having him hang around just makes it awkward. And it's kind of a...
Coach?
Yeah, I think it's a distraction. I think it's a distraction leading up to the biggest game in UCF history, arguably. All right, guys, it's an interesting debate. We'll see how it does shake out for Scott Frost if he eventually will be on the sideline in the Peach Bowl. Let's take a look at who excelled on the line this past weekend, brought to you by DXL, and it's Christian Wilkins, a big factor in Clemson's ACC title win, recording 7 tackles, a half sack, and also breaking up 2 passes as the Tigers routed the Canes to help lock up a spot in the playoff. Time now for today's F-bomb on why the trilogy of Clemson and Alabama is great for college football.
When the season began, we thought there would be another Alabama-Clemson, but we thought it would be in the finals. But we'll take what we have in the semis. It is an unbelievably delicious game for the 3rd time, and it's a revenge game for Nick Saban. How many times have we ever uttered that phrase, a revenge game for Nick Saban? But I think it's very important for Saban. Yes, he has a great legacy. He's won 5 national championships. But what if he loses to Dabo Swinney? What if he loses this game? That would really hurt. That would start to raise some questions. Maybe Saban's getting a little bit old. Maybe Dabo has his number. There's plenty of time to talk about it. But for now, I think we should luxuriate in the fact that we have this game again. After a long season, after a lot of controversy, this semifinal is one I can't wait for.
As the Tide and Tigers get set to square off on New Year's Day in New Orleans, let's remind you about what Paul is talking about. Alabama outlasted Clemson for the national title in Glendale 2 seasons ago, while the Tigers returned the favor last January, a last-second national title win in Tampa.